Okay, and welcome again to my World of Oriental Rugs. This is class 5, and it's going to be an exciting class. We're going to talk about what I call the second rug renaissance. I think it's not just me that calls it that. Pretty much all rug dealers recognize that the period between about 1880 and say World War I or just after that was a great renaissance. So it was the second great rug renaissance. Let me just start by showing you a couple of photographs of some of my booths. As I said last week, we do antique shows around the country. So here's just a photograph of some of my booths in different places that I do shows. There's a great eagle Kazak. That's an old Turkish Uşak. That's a wonderful Hariz on the floor. And there's my great serape that we're going to talk about today and how old it is. Here's another booth. I think this is in Charleston, South Carolina. That came out nice. That's that real beautiful Turkish piece. I talked about Turkish Gordy's silk rug that I sold already, but most of this stuff, this is just a picture of some bag faces and stuff, but this is part of my antique collection. Anyway, tonight, as I said, we're going to talk about the second great rug renaissance, but just to refresh your memory, the periods in the history of rugs. So there's this period from what we, 500 BC, which is the first rug, the oldest rug known to man at this time, up to about, 1500, 1499 is when the Safavid dynasty started. Then it had a little fall and it started up again, but that was the first great rug renaissance. And then, as I told you, today we're going to be talking about the second great rug renaissance. And then next week we'll do this honorable mention, and you'll understand that actually I think I titled it the decline and the honorable mention. And we'll explain that and how it's, started its long path back toward 1985 and the third great rug renaissance, which is 85 to the present time. So let's move along. The mid-19th century through the mid-20th century is what we call the second rug renaissance. And I say, well, the mid-19th century is accurate. The mid-20th century is stretching it. It really didn't last that long. It really stopped after World War I. Or shortly after World War I. So more like 1915, 1920. But now here's a lot. You don't have to read it all. Let me move my face out of the way a little bit here. In 1722, Persia was invaded by Afghanistan. So remember, 1722 is the end of the Safavid dynasty. Shah Abbas was in reign. But in 22, Persia invaded Afghanistan nomads, and between the Turks in the west and the Afghans in the east, there was very little rug weaving until the late 1800s. So this period from 1880 to 1915 is what we call the second great renaissance. By the late 19th century, the rug industry began to take on a new form and definition. By 1880, there was a new period of rest in Persia. Actually, it started probably around 1840 or 1850, and then the rest came. And then it's, as it says here, once again, Persia began to produce rugs, and it quickly began to become an industry. Okay, so what happened was, as it started to rest, then the Persians started weaving rugs again. Of course, there was no industry involved in it. They were just weaving rugs and maybe sending them to Tabriz or to one of the cities in Persia where it would be sold on market and then shipped overseas. But as they shipped them overseas, what happened was that people began to see the potential of rugs. And so, realizing the potential of exporting fine Oriental rugs to Europe and America, European companies began to set up looms in Persia and in India. In large factory-like buildings, looms were set up and villagers were put to work weaving rugs with motifs and colors based upon the previous work done in the area. So they were weaving whatever they did in that area. However, that began to change to production based on the demands of the market they were selling to. Some of the more famous companies were the Ziegler Company of Manchester, England, who set up looms in Mahal in 1883 and produced what is now referred to as Sultanabads, or some people call it a Ziegler Mahal. The Petag Company of Germany, who set up looms in Tabriz in 1885. Companies were also founded in Kashan in 1890, Kerman in 1885, Saruk in 1880. And by 1910, the US imported about 70% of the rugs that were made in Persia. And by the early 1900s, with the coming of European businessmen, there came even more demand for rugs to have more continuity, color, and design. So we'll talk about this word continuity in a little bit, but color and design. So in other words, there was a demand put on Persia to produce rugs more like the American and European market wanted. And so all of a sudden, it's kind of like an artist that just does whatever he likes. And then one day you find this artist and you love his kind of work, but you would like him to paint something and use the colors that are in your living room so that it will work in your living room. All of a sudden now he has gone from being just, a virgin artist that only does what he feels to do, to sort of like an industrialist who is now painting for the market that he's going to sell to. That's what happened with Oriental Rugs. Some people might look at that as a negative. I look at it as a positive because the demand made the rugs just get prettier and prettier, as you'll see soon. Anyway, rugs from the turn of the 20th century. Now, this is not all of them, but for the most part, they were coming mostly from Persia. There were a lot coming from Turkey. As I mentioned, India set up looms in the city of Agra, actually in a prison in Agra. Pakistan produced rugs, Kashmir, Tibet, the Caucasus, Turkmenistan, Bessarabia, which is part of Romania, and of course, China. But the big bulk of rugs were coming from Persia. So forces behind the second rug renaissance was the demand, the commercialization, buying what's available or producing what you want. And that included, what colors you want, what design you want. And then dyes, we mentioned last week about chrome dyes, and they were introduced in the early 1900s. So this made a big difference in the rug production of the second great rug renaissance. With demand and commercialization comes the development of motifs. So I'm going to give you some examples. I list here the classic examples are Serapi to Hariz, Sultanabad to Mahal, Farahan Saruk to Saruk. Let me explain what that means first, and then we'll take a look at them. So you've got, let's say, some people in the city of Hariz, and they're producing whatever they did for hundreds of years, and they have a style of weave and a motif that they like, and generally the colors that they like to work with. So they're doing their own thing and sending it to market. And around 1880, a rug dealer or an industrialist from Europe or America comes to the city of Hariz and says, let's set up looms and produce these things with more continuity, and let's get them shipped out. And they ship them to a rug dealer like me in America, and I get the rug, and my customers come in and they like them, but I keep hearing, gosh, can you make it a little busier? Can you add a little more color? Can you change it a little bit? And so we give that feedback to the industrialist or the rug company in the city of Hariz, and they began to tell the weavers, I want it changed a little bit. I want it this way instead of that way, and so on and so forth. So here's the trick. There is no such city as Serapi, no such city as Sultanabad, no such city as Farahan and Saruk. There is a Farahan and there is a Saruk, but no such city as Farahan Saruk. But a Serapi comes from Hariz, a Sultanabad comes from Mahal, a Farahan Saruk comes from Saruk. but there is such a distinguishing difference between the earlier ones and the later ones that rug dealers over the course of time sort of invented these made-up names, Serapi, Sultanabad, and Farahand Sarup, to distinguish them from the later rugs from the same city, Harith, Mahal, and Sarup. So let's take a look and you'll see what I mean, from Serapi to Harith. So here is a rug that we actually owned this years and years ago, and I sold it. But I dated this rug to be about 1860. Now, I have to tell you, truth is it could be 1830, 1840, 1850. I don't know. All I know is there's some distinguishing marks that started happening around 1880. And prior to that, you just have to base it on motifs and the dyes. And this one has this beautiful, it was probably at one point real green, and it's starting to turn to a teal color. And you see it in here, and you see the abrash, and you see the openness of the pattern. So I dated it to be about 1850, 1860. As with this one, you've seen pictures of this already, but again, it's a very early piece. It's not the same from one end to the other, so they didn't weave off a cartoon. They just wove out of the memory that they had of a design. Here's another piece, probably 1880, very early piece. They did a lot of rugs with ivory, but as the companies came in, they started to make them, I guess, for lack of a better word, I'd say a little more consistent and also a little more pretty. They started mixing the colors just right and making beautiful designs. And here's another rug that we call a Serapi. It's just an antique Harith, but this one, by now it's probably 1890, and there's a company that's overseeing the weaving of this. They send this rug to the US, but the US says, no, we want it a little brighter and a little more red. So you have a 1910 rug, and now you see, if you go back to these, you see the difference between what we call a Serapi and what we call a Harith. And so by 1915 or 1910, that's what this rug is, just before World War I, because it has some great greens and this soft light blue in the corners. You're producing rugs from the city of Harith that are more consistent with what we normally see as Harith rugs. By 1915, here's another Harith rug, but you see how they got busier and busier. So from Serapi to Harith, they got busier and they got brighter and deeper colors. The important thing about understanding this is that this is how we date rugs. So here's a rug that's probably by World War II. This is probably around 1940. But you can see the difference between, just track how they change, and so easy to date a rug by knowing what they did during the time, and just knowing how they transitioned and knowing that it's an earlier piece rather than a later piece. So here we have what's known as an old Sultanabad, or again, it could be referred to as a Ziegler Mahal, because although this might be a little earlier than Ziegler. Ziegler came in, took over the weave, and then just crafted it a little and made it a little nicer, like a piece like that, or like this. This is a perfect example of a Ziegler Mahal. They started to get a little busier than the older ones, but they kept an all-over motif, and it's still not too busy. But let's watch what happens. Again, that's a nice old Ziegler Mahal. They're using a beautiful green background. So here, now we're in the middle of the transition. We're probably about 1890 to 1900, and it's beginning to get busier and brighter colors. We still call that an old Sultanabad as opposed to a Mahal, but a lot of people could just call it a Mahal and they would be correct. In the auction houses, oftentimes, they don't call a Serapi, they call it an old Harith. And the same with Sultanabads, they don't call it a Sultanabad, they call it an old Mahal. So here you see classic Mahal. So they've gone, you see that how they've just transitioned into, and here's a 1915 classic mahal, nice rust background, but it doesn't have those pale colors like they used to. They've added a lot of navy in the border and so on and so forth. So they have become a lot darker than the earlier ones, but it's just what the demand demanded. And so now let's look at this, and perhaps this is probably one of the most controversial ones, and because it just gets a little confusing. Farahand Saruk and Saruks actually not only changed the color and the pattern somewhat, but they actually even changed the style of weave completely. So that makes it a little more interesting and a little more confusing. So here you have a real early Farahand Saruk. I'm dating that one to be about 1880, all over pattern, but typical things that you would see in a Farahand Saruk. And by the way, remember when we were talking about construction and I talked about warps and wefts? Well, one of the attributes of a Farahand Saruk, and I think most times even regular Saruks, is they used a blue weft thread, a light blue color, light blue cotton weft thread. So you can always tell a Farahand Saruk because if you look on the back, you see just barely see some of the weft threads and they're light blue. But here's a really early piece. I date this to be about 1870 or 1880. So this is what they were weaving in the city of Saruk, you know, before the industrialization or commercialization. Here's another piece. This one might even be 1870. Look at like the square here versus the square there. Every one of them is different. They weren't weaving from a cartoon. They were just weaving the way they always did things. And it just, this is what they produce. So, but now it's starting to get a little dressier. So you probably now you've moved into about 1890 and the Farahand Saruk is getting a little bit dressier. Again, it's this real thin, tight weave. And that's one of the characteristics of the change that happened when we get to a regular Saruk. Now, the weave has changed. I can't actually show you, but if you were to feel this rug, it is much thicker than that rug. But it's a more traditional Saruk. They kept some of the earlier colors, the rust and the navy, but they started getting a thicker pile and also deeper colors. And so you have by 1910 or 1915, the classic red Saruk, that so many of these were brought to the United States. And there you have a 1930 piece, and it's just the classic red Saruk. So again, you see the transition that took place from that to this, to that, to that, to that, to that. And again, that's why we call the older ones a Farahand Saruk as opposed to Saruk, just to distinguish them in age. Actually, not to confuse things, but if we were to accurately draw that timeline of when things were made, and we talk about the second great rug renaissance from being, let's say, 1870 to 1920, the truth is, inside of that, there's the period from 1870 to about 1890, and then 1890 to 1920. And that is the earlier pieces that were done before commercialization versus the pieces that were done after commercialization. And after commercialization, you can just watch the transition. Now, this didn't just happen in those three cities. It happened all over the country. Transitions in other rugs, and it's a key to determining the circle or the age of a rug. This is how I know the age of rugs. So here's the city of Karaja. This is a 1920 or actually 1915 Karaja. But look, before that, they were less busy, and before that, they were even less busy. So this one's probably 1880, 1870 to 1900 to 1910. And this is just what you see. Hamadan, 1890, 1900, 1920. It's just, and you see the transit, you see how they got busier and busier as they went. Okay, in the city of Bidjar, Bidjars were producing these wonderful, beautiful old rugs. They did several different patterns. This is one of their most classic patterns, with the big field and the medallion and these two big anchors. As I told you, I call them, even though they're actually big flowers of some sort in the spandrels. But then they just got busier and busier. Now, here is an interesting thing. I just threw this in because I didn't know where else to put it. But back in, by 1890, there was companies set up in the city of Bidjar, and this is not just Bidjar that did this. Hamadan and several other companies did this as well from other cities, but they produced these small little versions. This is about a, less than a 3x5 rug, and they would put, like this one has that style medallion, this style field, or that corner, and or as you can see here, this one gives you several different types of borders that it could do. And you can see it again in this. There's that sort of corner, this kind of field, but you can have this, you can have that, you can have different types of borders or whatever. These were known as Bidjar Samplers. They all come from I'd say 1885 to about 1910. Here's another little city near Hariz called Sarab. And just look at the difference between, in 1880 Sarab, where this medallion is different than that medallion because they weren't weaving from cartoon. But now they've got a cartoon, the motif is pretty accurate all the way through, and the colors are just a little sharper than the earlier pieces. Kerman is probably another one of the best examples, although we don't really call the older Kermans by any other name, except that sometimes we call them, these earlier ones, we call a lavar Kerman. And lavar is just an Persian adjective that means beautiful or very fine. But so you've got, here you have right around the turn of the century, maybe 1890 to 1900. And then they begun to transition into, by 1910, they were, they always stayed a little busy. And in fact, in some cases, they got less busy, but different colors. And by 1920, they started doing this with the solid field. This motif mainly went to Europe. This is what we would refer to as European Kerman. And this is, by 1950, this is the American market Kerman. But you see the transition, and if you understand this in every rug, you'll understand how we can date rugs accurate. Look at what happened from Tabriz, an early Tabriz. This is obviously a very, very fine Tabriz. It has two crowns here and there. It's just a gorgeous early Tabriz, probably around 1890. And well, I didn't have many examples of like 1930 or 1940, but this is by 1960, that's what they're producing. Isfahan. Just look at the, now, I told you a term that my dad used to use all the time was muted, and just look at the softness of it in the patina. It just has such a wonderful patina, but as they get newer, and of course, this is all vegetable dyes. Now they've gone to chrome dyes in Isfahan, so the color stayed a little sharp and they wouldn't develop the patina of the old ones. Okay, so I hope you see this transition, and it happened in so many rugs, but still they were beautiful rugs either way. Next week, as we talk about, we'll talk about the decline and how some of the rugs, I feel like, they started using chrome dyes, they started getting brighter and uglier. In fact, they started making sarooks that were so bright and garish that when they got to the United States, they were sent to this factory on Long Island where they were given a chemical bath, and it took out the garish red color. The problem is it took it out so bad that they then had to go back and actually re-dye some of the red in them. So they were called the washed and painted sarooks. And this is what happened. Somehow or another in Persia, they thought they wanted this garish, purplish red color. They got to America. They sent them directly to this factory. By the way, the factory still exists. It's out on Long Island. They gave them a chemical wash, and then they had, maybe I'll find a photograph and show it to you, but they had this large factories with big ink vaults hanging, suspended from the ceiling, and hoses that came down to one of those Sharpie pins. And people would just sit there and repaint the red, not in this rug, but that's what they would do. They repaint the red, and it was called the washed and painted Saruks. Here's just a little FYI or for your information kind of thing. It's how we date rugs. Well, I mean, no, I showed you how we date rugs. We date rugs because we know when they were made and the changes that happen. But every now and then, let me show you an example. Every now and then you'll find a rug with a little date in it like that. Here's a close-up of it. And so for this one, this is probably a signature on the outside. That's 132. So if we come back to here, you know, there's ones, different types of twos, different types of threes. However, most times it was the Islamic dates in an older Oriental rug. So the Oriental rugs woven and dated in the 17th through 19th century almost always use an Islamic lunar calendar. So there's a formula here to convert it to Islamic calendar, but for the most part, it's about 622 years, give or take. So this rug that I said was 132, adds 622 years, makes it 1920. But actually, I think that one actually dates to be 1908. So, but it's the Islamic date, 1290 minus 38 plus 622 equals the Christian date of 1874. So there's a simple formula to date the rugs, and it's not, I mean, I don't know that this is very important for you to know, but it's kind of interesting when you see the dates that you can figure out when it is. Actually, you know, I read that backward. This is 123. So 1230. That's why I know this is I think this is right around 1900. And now, occasionally, especially in the Caucasus area, the Caucasus is the area just north of Iran, just east of Turkey. And it's where Armenians are from. And in fact, it's now, since Russia fell and the USSR fell, it has become the nation of Armenia again, as it was in the late 1800s. But now it's Armenia. But they were Christians, so they didn't use the Muslim calendar. This is 1908, I guess, is what that says. But they use the American calendar. So that's kind of interesting. Oh gosh, I don't know what just happened. Well, that's the end of the slide. So I hope you have enjoyed this lesson. I hope I didn't throw too much at you, but it's just a great period in rugs, in the history of rugs. You know, if you go back and just once again take a look at, you know, these rugs. I mean, some of the most beautiful rugs in the world came from this period between 1880 and 1910 or 1915. Some, you know, beautiful old Karajas and Paris like that, Dagestan from the Caucasus, a beautiful Saruk from around 1910, an early Hamadan. You know, let me go back. The Serapi, there's a wonderful Haris, there's a Caucasian Kazakh. All of these are from that period. It was one of the greatest periods. Next week, I'm gonna show you how each of these rugs begun to sort of decline in its looks. And I understand, you know, when I use that, when I tell people, you know, what's the most important thing to look for in a rug? And I tell them it's color, 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 harmony, and color. And I understand that beauty, you know, we have a motto, rugs as art, because we try to sell beautiful things. I understand there's different strokes for different folks, but I can tell you that 80% of the people fall into a category and we all agree in terms of what's beautiful. every now and then you find people that want a purple and pink rug, and that's just the way it is, and they think that's beautiful, and I understand it, and I try to see it for them and whatever, but most people agree these are beautiful rugs, and I hope you do too. It was great talking to you. Next week we'll talk about the period in between the second Renaissance and the third Renaissance. And it's going to be fun because I'm going to show you the decline. And then I'm going to show you as it tried to get back to something nicer, but even the height of the something nicer doesn't compare to the rugs that were produced after 1985. And you will see that next week real clearly. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you check us out. Don't forget to come by one day and pick up one of those little brochures I told you about. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.